Let me minimize that. Let me maximize this. Let me. This is what. So give me a second. Get back to duplicate.
No, this is another one with the same.
So this is second of my occasional series of software retrospectives. And if you came to the last one, you remember the purpose of this session is to try and distill some historical wisdom out of books and other sources, stuff that maybe you weren't aware of, you might have missed out on because some of it's quite old, but which is still applicable and classic and worth knowing about. And this time around, we're going to look at The Mythical Man Month by Fred Brooks and Tom DeMarco's Slack, which are two books separated by quite a distance of years and time, but fundamentally they're about the same thing. And this is probably the least technical session I've ever done at Euromoney. There will be no code. There'll be no talking about code. There will be no coding techniques. This is really a talk about how we manage people and projects, and how companies do this badly, and what we can do to fix that. So whilst it's obviously important for managers, it's important for everybody really to understand these lessons because they're key. And interestingly, in the time since the Mythical Man Month was written, not a lot has changed, which is a shame. Yeah, that's a quick show of hands. Anybody read the Mythical Man Month? Anybody read Slack? Okay, definitely recommend you all read Slack. It's a great book. Mythical Man Month is well worth a read. It can be a bit of a chore.
See how you call it in its context.
Yes,
if you already
got
know,
to see it being of its time.
If you already know, well, this talk through. If you already know, this is things. What would you get out of reading it? I guess you're gonna.
I shall explain. Yes, there's more to it than just that. But yeah, the fundamental point is about the Mythical Man Month and the paradox of adding people to a project doesn't actually make it run any quicker. So the book was written originally in 1975, which for some of you is an unthinkable amount of time ago. I was actually alive then. I recall it being mostly polyester and lots of flares and long hair. I was only 4, mind you, so I could be wrong. And Brooks has been around for a long time. I think he's still with us. He ran a lot of large software projects in the early days, particularly at IBM, where he worked for a long time, DEC and other places. So this book is based largely on his experiences building System 360 OS for the 360 series IBM mainframe. It is an old book. The terminology he uses is dated. You'll recognize it, you'll be able to translate it into modern day stuff, but he refers to stuff in ways that he talks about programmers rather than developers and stuff like that. The prose will be quite dense. He writes it slightly academically, the way that old books used to be written, and quite hard to pass. There's no really any trace of anything modern like Agile. Things like waterfall are taken for granted in there. Although later on, when he added some addenda, he did talk about some of the more modern ideas. But the wisdom in the book is pretty profound, and it mostly still holds true today, which just shows that we've really improved very little in the last 40 years. So shame on all of us. So, okay. First thing to talk about, Brooks' Law. Adding manpower to a late software project makes it later. Let that sink in for a minute. Exactly. Well, if you think about it, it should make sense. It's surprising that everybody doesn't kind of automatically realize that, but you'll all have encountered the situation where your project manager or your boss or your head of technology says, God, we've got to get this thing out. Let's just add some more people and we'll get it done quicker. The short answer is that doesn't work. The reasons why are many, but every person that you add to a project has got to be inducted into the project. They're going to be trained on the project and its goals, on its technologies. They may not actually know the technology, or if they do, they might not understand the specifics of how you're using it. They're going to be monitored while they're training, because you can't let them loose on the project while they don't know what they're doing. So while they're doing this, they're not working on the project, or they're not working on it full time at full capacity. And equally, the person or people training and monitoring and mentoring them are not working full-time on the project either, at a point where they should be working full-time on the project. So there's a net loss of overall effort for a period that could last for weeks or months, depending on the nature of a project. Bring on a contractor on a large software project, it could easily be 3 months before they're properly productive. During that time, if I've lost half my time bringing them up to speed, that's a month and a person and a half month that we've lost off the project, and that just builds the more that you add. So the more add one person, it may have some beneficial effect if you can take the hit up front if it's a long project. 2 people, maybe. Once you start to scale beyond that, once you're talking about adding 5, 6, 10 people to a project, it's just going to make it worse. So once it's late, it's already late. Every person you add to a project adds other overhead. So management time, somebody's going to manage them and look after them and have their one-to-ones and do their reviews and so forth. Communication time, you're now communicating with a much larger number of people. So, okay, email, you can broadcast it, but face-to-face comms, you have to go and talk to people. You end up having more meetings, bigger meetings, longer meetings, because everybody wants to have a say. And it all just adds overhead to your project and makes it slower, not faster. And this is really at the core of the book. Helen?
What happens if we have something like so I'm just thinking about stand-ups, right?
Mm-hmm.
What happens if we have stand-ups where half the intention of having additional people there is to have some cross-pollination of education about the work that's being done on the parallel project?
Well, if you've got separate project streams running simultaneously and you want to cross-pollinate them, then there's no reason why people can't attend each other's stand-ups. But then, even then, you're still doubling up on stand-ups, which is slowing them down a little bit.
Yeah, I know that. But the intention of that is that when one of those resources does drop out, or it is particularly late, this person doesn't need the full training and everything to get back.
I see your point. I mean, there are some mitigating things you can do, but none of them overcome in my experience, none of them overcome the overall impact of this stuff. And besides which, the real thing, the truth is, you'll never actually do what you're suggesting, because everything you want to do is adding more overhead to the project, and the last thing that any project manager will want to do is add overhead, because you're probably already behind time anyway. So they want to be taking things out of the schedule, not putting things in. This actually comes on to the next point that Brooks talks about, which is estimating, and why estimates are usually wrong. So software project estimating is more of an art than a science, as those of us that do it know, and it's not particularly good art either. Reasons why there are no hard and fast numbers to base your estimates on, because 9 times out of 10, when you're doing something and estimating something, it's something you haven't actually done before. Yes, we all know how long it takes to do certain small repetitive tasks. We know roughly how long it takes to build a blank web page or create a Visual Studio solution. But if I said to you, Andrew, I need to build a system that will let me book tickets for these software retrospectives in future, so I can sell them to outside people to come and listen to my wisdom. How long will that take you?
I think I have to think about the system.
No, you haven't got time to think. How long will that take you? Come on, estimate.
You'll be held to this, by the way.
Yeah, and you'll be held to this if you don't. You'll be in trouble. Exactly. It's all about yeah, exactly. So this is the world that we tend to live in. Businesses in particular always want numbers up front before they're even willing to start investing money in a project. And quite reasonably, they want to know, how much is it going to cost me? How long? When can I have it? Is this going to fit in my business cycle? But estimating is really hard. Software is abstract, and we're dealing with complicated abstract ideas that it's not like other engineering disciplines where it's kind of all been done before. You build a bridge, you can break a bridge down into its component parts. You can know roughly how long it'll take to each, because we've built thousands of bridges. Okay, if you introduce new techniques and new materials, then that's a random factor. But once a few of those have been done, then again, it's a matter of received wisdom. There's very little received wisdom in our business. And it's interesting that we've been in this business for 50, 60 years, and it's not much better than it ever was, and there are magic methods and silver bullets coming out of the walls. I'll talk about silver bullets in a minute, actually. Everywhere, and in my experience, none of them work. We just have to live with the fact that this stuff is difficult. The other thing is that we always assume the best case. When you make an estimate, you assume that nothing's going to go wrong. So your estimate is based on, well, if nothing goes wrong, then it will take me this amount of time. But how often do you work on a project when nothing goes wrong? Stuff always goes wrong. There's always uncertainty. There's always doubt. Stuff, people break their legs. They have unexpected holidays. Technology just doesn't work. You assume it will, and it doesn't. Your operating system breaks. IT turns something off that you need. You make a false assumption. These things happen all the time. So it's logically impossible to schedule for the unknown. You can't say how long, how much disruption you will have because you can't possibly know how much there will be. Okay, fine. So you add some contingency, but we tend to be optimistic about our contingency. We don't put enough in because if we say to a project manager, okay, I think it will take 6 weeks, and then I want to add like 50% contingency to just be on the safe side. So they say, what, 9 weeks? But you said it would take 6. Yeah, but well, maybe we can add a week's contingency, but any more than that, and it will look bad in front of my boss, which I don't want to do. So the first thing management will do is make you cut out your contingency. A number of times I've submitted a project plan with lots of contingency, and then I've got to cut that out, and then usually most of the testing time as well. And these are for projects that are late from the day they start because they've already been set a deadline at the end of it that was unrealistic in the first place, and you're late starting. So schedules are not realistic. It's all a big ball of mud, and there are Brooks recognises that if a project is late, project with a fixed deadline, it's likely to miss that deadline. That's the simple truth. Fixed deadlines are bad. Now, one of the things that we've adopted with our agile process is there are effectively no fixed deadlines. Although Andrew may dispute that because he works for Telcam. But okay, sometimes you do have an immovable deadline for something, but in that case, you start the project long enough in advance that you can possibly have a chance of finishing it. I've worked against fixed deadlines for like sporting events, so we just started really, really early because we knew that if we slipped, we would miss the date, and that was literally unacceptable. So we did what we had to do. Why don't other projects do that? Why don't other projects say, actually, I've got a fixed deadline here, and I should have been thinking about this 6 months ago, not now. But business doesn't seem to work that way, and it doesn't seem to have gotten any better since Brooks's day. So Brooks then goes on to talk about software teams and how you would organize them. And he talks about contrasting what he calls a small, sharp team with what I've then called a large, blunt team, because he doesn't give it a name, but that's the opposite name. So a small, sharp team would consist of top tier, what he's calling 10 times programmers. You've heard this sort of phrase, 10 times programmers, or rock star programmers, or superstars, or whatever. These are these mythical creatures that can work 10 times faster than any of us in this room. If you know such a person, I'll be interested to hear about it. I've never met one in real life. Some people are a bit faster than others, some people aren't, but these are your top tier guys. These are the absolute superstars of your team. They're experts. They're extremely productive. They can self-organize. They can self-manage. They don't need leaders and project managers. It's a small team. It gets on with it. The large blunt team, on the other hand, it consists of many average programmers who work at an average speed, which is fine. They're less productive individually, but the team gets more done en masse because there's a lot more of them. But, and this is the key thing, that team now needs leadership and it needs management. Therefore, it has to have a process, and all these things start to add overhead. So what Brooks says is, if you can get away with a small, sharp team, get away with a small, sharp team, because the less ceremony you have, the less management you have, the more likely you are to ship on time. But if you can't, or you just don't have the talent, then you're going to need leadership, you're going to need management, and you're going to need process. So then he talks about this idea of the surgical team. He proposes this is a model that kind of sits somewhere between the two. And in the surgical team, you have a surgeon, who I guess we would call a lead developer or maybe a dev manager. And this guy is the dictator, and he rules the roost. And you can't dissent. That's his job. He makes the decisions, and you follow them. And it's intended that he will be the superstar programmer. Then there's a co-pilot, who will be his deputy. But the co-pilot is only allowed to make decisions when the surgeon is absent. So again, it's not a democracy. It's all about, and he talks about this specifically, like aristocracy versus democracy. It comes down very heavily on the aristocracy side. But the idea is that clear decision making is necessary to cut through the crap. The administrator then is basically a project manager. The editor does documentation and specifications. I'm thinking that may be something like a BA. You have to have 2 secretaries on the project, one for the editor and one for the surgeon, because you couldn't get anything done in the 70s without secretaries. The clerk maintains records, like project logs and so forth. These days, you would do that yourself with Jira and stuff like that. There's a toolsmith, who's basically a DevOps guy, so responsible for the dev tools and environments and all of that sort of stuff. There's a tester, who is our QA. And then what he calls the language lawyer. And the best definition I can find for that is some kind of technical consultant, basically David Whitney. Somebody who doesn't lead the project, doesn't actually code in the project, but they find all the neat hacks that are going to make the project go that little bit faster. And he says basically, if you need more people than that, just have another one of those teams, divide the work up between the teams, and the surgeons meet in a council of peers every so often. Basically, if you have more people than that, more than 10 people on a team, he says, not going to work. That's his philosophy for this system, at least. So other stuff that he advocates in the book, and I'm shortening it down for the purpose of actually getting through this. Conceptual integrity, he calls. I think we probably call it maybe architecture, or I talked in DDD about the ubiquitous language. So the idea that you have a single language for what you call things, and making sure you use that stuff absolutely consistently. So conceptual integrity to him is that it's consistency in how you describe and model things. Aristocracy versus democracy. He's very clearly in favour of aristocracy. He says clear leadership is more important than collective responsibility. He does point out that good leader listens to the people on his team and doesn't just barge in, but it's very clear that it's not about waiting for, the avalanche has already started, it's too late for the pebbles to vote. He talks about prototyping a lot. He specifically says plan to throw one away because you will anyhow. And it was actually pretty common in olden days of software to write some kind of prototype, probably in a different language or a different environment to what you'd write your final thing in. It's actually not that uncommon to things like InVision and some of these wireframing tools where what amounts to kind of either a paper prototype or a clickable prototype, you will throw that stuff away. But people don't really write prototype code anymore, prototype systems. He's very into his waterfall. Clearly believes in heavy specifications, detailed specifications, big upfront design, and all the stuff that goes with it. And he's very clear that if you don't have detailed specifications, you're going to go awry. And in truth, in waterfall, that is absolutely true. He believes in documentation, and lots of it must be clear and comprehensive. There were no automated tools at that point, so it was generally typed on paper. You should plan for change because it's going to happen. It's a truism, we all know it, but it's worth saying. He also says managers should program. That's a key thing. So managers should not be non-programmers. Non-programmers should not manage programmers. So if you're a programmer, your boss should be a programmer. That then leads to an infinite loop at which you can't have a boss. Somebody somewhere has got to have a boss that's not a programmer. I suppose it's allowed to just tail away. Maybe better if your boss is an ex-programmer or something like Jonathan. I didn't really say that, did I? Honestly, I love you, Jonathan. There should be a single tool set shared by everybody and a single standards for everybody. People shouldn't be allowed to do their own things, go to the reservation, use their own tools. Everybody uses the same stuff, talks about stuff in the same way, uses the same standards. And he also advocates something called top-down design, which is an idea that came from a chap called Nicholas Wirth. Everybody aware of Nicholas Wirth? Nicholas Wirth is a very interesting man. Amongst other things, he invented the Pascal programming language. He was one of the early advocates and luminaries in what is called structured programming. So structured programming is kind of what came before object-oriented programming. And it was full of go-tos and go-subs and stuff like that, which was actually pretty revolutionary back in its day. And top-down design is, I won't go into it in much detail, but it's a design technique that, as it sounds, starts at the highest level of abstraction and then gradually works its way down, rather than the bottom-up approach, which a lot of people use today, which is break the thing into your component parts, then work on each component subsystem, and then integrate them all together into one big fundamental system. There may be some wisdom in me actually looking into a session on that just in and of itself. Then let's talk about No Silver Bullet. No Silver Bullet is actually, you'll find it's a chapter in the book, but it's actually originally a separate essay. Most of the chapters in the book were originally separate essays. And it wasn't in the original book, it was added to the second edition of the book. He wrote it in 1986, so when things had already moved on a little bit. But the basic thesis of No Silver Bullet is that there is no single development in either technology or management technique which by itself promises even one order of magnitude improvement within a decade in productivity, in reliability, or simplicity. That's a fairly negative viewpoint to take, but it's actually a really important fact. There is no silver bullet. There's no one single thing that you can do that will transform all of the problems that we've talked about and fix them all. Not going to happen. It'll never happen. No matter how many snake oil salesmen tell you they've got the solution, and there have been many over the years, model-driven architecture and God help us, computer aided. What am I thinking of? Not computer aided design. Well, there's RAD, yeah, but something specific I'm thinking of, and in mind, expert systems, all that kind of stuff. He points out that software is hard, as I mentioned, because it's abstract, and fundamentally it always will be, because we deal in abstractions for a living, and abstractions require human beings, short of proper AI. And abstract thought is difficult. Not everybody can do it, and it takes time. Nobody can think any faster than you can't. I can't say, Andrew, think faster, and you're going to go, okay, yeah, I'm going to overclock my brain a little bit. It doesn't happen. Short of certain drugs, you really can't do much to make yourself think faster. If only that drug from Limitless were really real, then I'd be buying it for all of you. There'd be no limit to what we can achieve, but sadly, yeah. I mean, there are some supposedly nootropic drugs that can help you think faster, but I'll believe it when I see it. He does then go through in Silver Bullet some techniques, some ideas that were kind of new at the time that he thinks are potentially promising. I'm not going to list them all, but there are a couple. He mentioned AI explicitly, and it's interesting that back in the 80s, everybody thought AI was right around the corner. And people remember like 5th generation software and all the Japanese research projects and Prolog, Fuzzy Logic, Prolog, all this sort of stuff. AI was like really going to happen real soon now. And also mentions object-oriented programming, which was spanky and new in those days. 1986 was actually when the first early version of C++, which was then called C with classes, was released by Bjarne Stroustrup. Now, obviously, that wasn't the first object-oriented language. There were many in Smalltalk had been around for a long time, and Similar had been around for a long time before that. But it was a relatively new idea. And it's if you weren't around at the time, it's hard to forget how kind of how radical it was as an idea. How people would literally sit around and discuss: is OOP a good idea? Should we do this? Surely, structured programming is better. Now we take it for granted. Everything's OOP. If anything, we seem to be evolving into a post-OOP age where people are saying, who needs objects when you've got functions as first-class citizen? But back in those days, it really was quite radical. And he mentions iterative development, which is effectively what becomes agile. It's this idea of moving away from waterfall, away from big upfront design into something more approaching agility. And then 20 years later, in the preface to the 3rd edition, which he wrote in 1995, he finally admits he was wrong on certain things. In particular, prototyping, he doesn't think now that you should plan to throw one away. Waterfall, he acknowledges that it doesn't work and is excited by the new iterative method. And Agile was just kind of starting to come out of the closet at that point. I think XP was being worked on by Kent Beck et al. And I was starting to hear stuff about it from people that I knew, although it was definitely early days. And OO, the interesting thing is, although he mentioned OO as something that he thought was promising, he was very skeptical about the notion of what was called information hiding, which is the old name for encapsulation. He thought that was a silly idea, that closing off your classes so that you couldn't see the insides and fiddle with them was just making life difficult for yourself. But he now recognizes that it's absolutely necessary. And as I mentioned, that's ironic because particularly with things like encapsulation inheritance, they're all kind of going out of fashion now. Who inherits anymore when they can implement an interface, and people don't seem to encapsulate anymore. They're quite happy to expose stuff at the public API that maybe they shouldn't, in the name of God help me testability and stuff like that. Yeah. But the central thesis of the book is as true today as it was in '75. If you add more people to a late software project, it makes it later. And so the question I would ask is, perhaps it's time for us to stop doing that. So that's Mythical Man Month. Now we move on to Slack. Slack is.
I want to think about the estimates thing a bit more. Because from a lot of what I've read about the whole estimates thing is it's obviously a necessity because you need to have someone in place.
Yeah, of course.
Because you have future deadlines. But from what I've seen, some of the best estimation methods have been, do you reckon this is huge or not so huge? And that's just keeping it that vague.
Yeah.
And then just tossing it out, and it's usually 70% accurate sort of thing. So it's good enough to sort of do some planning.
Yeah. And we do around here in some places we do the small medium, t-shirt sizing, small medium large, extra large for tasks, which then bleeds into the project as a whole, or we do story pointing. These are all efforts to try and overcome the notion of give me a number, give me a fixed solid number. But it can be difficult to avoid, particularly at the interface between technology and the business, the desire of senior managers to have a number, a meaningful number. Because I guarantee you, if your head of technology is going to his divisional director and translating the story points that you've got into some kind of date or number, that he thinks he can probably manage to deliver on.
Yeah.
Because although it's getting better and we are training up the DDs and indeed everybody in the business to speak agile, it's a really hard sell for someone that's used to the idea that I can just ask somebody how long will it take to do X and get a reasonably good answer that will be reasonably accurate.
Like if you're
Yeah.
finish to think you can just ask someone how long is this going to take.
Exactly.
That's why like it seems like just the casual estimate, not spending much time,
Mm-hmm.
like spending almost zero time on this estimate is like as good as any other method.
I don't disagree. I think developers get better at estimation during their career. It's just you get a knack for it, you get a feel for it. It's easier to t-shirt size, I think, when you've got several projects under your belt.
Yeah.
Because what you'll notice, particularly with more junior programmers, or depending on the relationship you have with your team, is that people will tend to overestimate the size of a problem because it looks difficult, and they don't want to be caught underestimating it. That's the last thing they want to do, is say, this is a medium problem, when actually it turns out to be extra large. So everything suddenly becomes extra large, and then you've got 20-point stories on your Jira board, not anybody in particular.
And that is an actual problem. Like that's an actual thing that, it takes a bit of work to sort of mitigate that problem. Like I had a developer not even that long ago say they were doing something and they're like, okay, so there's 8 story points. How long in time units is a story point? I was just like, what?
That's
what are you
not
talking
the
about?
point.
I'm like, he was the developer. I'm like, yeah, we're not measuring you like that. We're not saying this is 8, it should take 10 days.
Well, to be fair, I used to work in effort days in my previous companies. On my estimates would be in effort days; they would not be in points.
Yeah.
And sometimes we would get spanked for missing them quite heavily. But again, I was in a situation where I had to give a cost estimate, and costs were related to effort days because of recharges. And that's another thing, of course, that happens around here because we recharge. So if it was easy, everybody would be doing it. But
natural to want to really point to something tangible in the real world.
Yeah, completely.
And that is one of the things that's
You'd actually hope in a mature team with a very regular velocity, you will start to make those kind of connections. Right? Between.
If you have consistency.
Yeah, you have consistency for a while.
Yeah.
But it's not something you can do straight out of the box.
No,
but that's
you
only
get better
gonna
at
be
it.
true if you like look at 90% of cases. You're still going to have the 10% of cases where it doesn't, the pattern falls apart.
You are.
And it's
You
just
absolutely
really
are.
coincidence that you get to that velocity. Anyway.
Okay. We'll have more time for chatting. I've actually booked the room out till 2, so if people can stay after 1:30, then we can carry on having a chat. But let's move on and talk about Slack. Now, Slack's a slightly different kind of book. It's more about people, and as you'd expect from the author of Peopleware, which is Tom DeMarco's other main book, which again I recommend reading. Tom is an ex-programmer who became a management consultant and has worked for some of the biggest Silicon Valley companies as a management consultant. This book was written in 2001, so it's rather more modern. It is essentially a handbook for managers, and in fact, it says a handbook for managers, entrepreneurs, and CEOs. But it is a great read for anybody who is in the category of knowledge worker, which is pretty much all of us. It's based around the central concept of Slack, which in essence, it means time for invention or time for change. It's a really bad word for it. I mean, it's a good word because it actually encapsulates what it's all about, and I think all of us as programmers could probably get that. But you go and talk about Slack to a business person, oh, do they hate it? Because to them, Slack means slacking, laziness, inefficiency, not getting anything done. You talk about I need to introduce Slack into my process. They're like, well, no, you don't. You want to make your process more efficient, not less. It is specifically about knowledge workers, software, digital work. You couldn't apply these principles to factory work or building cars or mining gold or any of those things. Like the Mythical Man Month, it's basically a book of essays bound together into some topics. It was written in the throes of the dot-com crash, if you remember, back to 2001. But the lessons are still relevant today because we are in similarly financially tightened times.
Going to the next crash.
Yeah, pretty much. People are starting to talk about the next great dot-com crash. When I don't know, maybe who's going to go down first?
Twitter's already firing people.
Yeah, and well, Twitter's business model has always been screwed, basically. I think Wikipedia should take over Twitter and make it voluntary contributions only. All right, so what is Slack? Let's define Slack. So slack is what you have when you have time to change. Slack is what you have when you're only 80% efficient. Slack is what you need to innovate and to reinvent and to change. And without slack, change is nigh on impossible, and you're doomed to repeat a vicious cycle of attempting to change and failing. Modern management practice hates slack. And DeMarco's philosophy is that this is why modern management practice sucks. He talks about the efficiency myth. So most companies, most of the time, are focused on increasing efficiency and cutting costs. Do more with less. You know, everyone's expected to be busy 100% of the time. Like, you've all got to recharge 100% of your time. If you're only 60% busy, well, then there's 40% of your time we could be using elsewhere. The fact that you're not like a piece of meat that can be cut into slices and distributed, the fact you're not fungible doesn't matter, because you are really, you're resource, you're not people. Of course, context switches, everything else means that doesn't work. Yes, you can work on two things at one time, but there's a penalty to be paid for doing that. There's a penalty in time every time I switch from this to that. Even if I do one day here and one day there, I've still got to remember where I was 2 days ago when I go back to it. In this philosophy, middle management does nothing useful and should basically be eliminated. So I'm out, you're out. Matrix management is in. We love matrix management. So report to 12 bosses instead of the one. I mean, report situationally to the people you're working for, not to somebody who does your reviews. But, says DeMarco, that's all wrong. And I think hopefully we'd agree with him. Probably the most counterintuitive thing is the business about efficiency, that actually when you increase your efficiency, you decrease your ability to change. The reason for that is because you don't have slack. So if you're 100% busy, you have no slack. Without slack, you can't innovate or step back to review and change how you work. Right. DeMarco says that the primary responsibility of middle management is to reinvent the organization in response to change. Yeah, okay, we do reviews, we pass paperwork around and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, the real job of middle managers that neither the people at the coalface can do or the most senior people in the organization can do is reinvent how we work. It's no surprise that reorgs tend to come from the middle management layer. Those are the people that that learn the lessons from the people doing the job and communicate them back up to the senior managers. So by increasing efficiency, you're decreasing flexibility. You can't respond to change, and hence, and again I'm quoting from the book, when companies can't invent, it's usually because their people are too damn busy. Then he talks about how companies respond to these negative outcomes they get when they're far too efficient and have no slack. He says they often respond to it by expecting staff just to work longer hours. Now, this is counterproductive because, as we all know, beyond a few hours of overtime here or there, you start to burn out, you start to slow down. Right? And so the overall productivity stays the same. You're in the office for longer hours, but you're not getting any more done. Everything you're doing is slower, you're tired, you're punchy, you make more mistakes. The more overworked you become, particularly if you're being forced to work hard rather than volunteering to do it, you will find ways to claw back time from your regular work hours, which DeMarco calls undertime. So this is long lunch breaks and, I need to disappear for a couple of hours because, don't worry, I'm working later, it's fine. It talks about the hero myth, the idea that an impossible deadline can be achieved, always be achieved by a sufficiently motivated team. This is something that managers love to pretend is real. So come on, guys, if only we pull together hard enough, we can make anything happen. It's the American dream. It's not true. It's a myth. Practice never works, or almost never works, and it always leaves negative results. So even if you put in a massive, heroic, death march effort, and you manage to deliver the project with skin of your teeth on the last possible day, and it kind of works, and everybody's like, phew, that was a close one, you know what's going to happen immediately after that, which is that half the staff are going to resign because they just don't want to work there anymore. So then come the incentives. We'll make you work harder for rewards. We'll actually reward you for working harder. So, I'll give you a red letter day, or maybe I'll take you out for dinner at a nice restaurant, or I might even consider giving you a small bonus, a couple of £100 here or there, maybe. Yeah, book tokens, that's a good one. Incentives are usually derisory like that, and the reason is because by the time the company gets into the situation where they need to provide incentives, they probably haven't got enough money to be giving you any decent rewards anyway. And this then sends a signal to everybody that the place is in trouble. So it's actually doing more harm than good because people are not taking up the incentives and thinking, Christ, if it's that bad, maybe I should be looking elsewhere for a job. And the few people that do take on the incentives are not going to increase your productivity by a dramatic amount for exactly the reasons we talked about earlier, that they're burning out, they're slowing down. if they're willing to accept book tokens, they probably don't care anyway. They're probably more interested in book tokens than the work they're doing. So let's face up to it. If the deadline was missed, then the schedule was just wrong in the first place. There's no getting around it. So DeMarco's first law of bad management is, if something isn't working, do more of it. You may have seen some examples of that in your career. I'll leave you to reflect on that. And his second law of bad management, which unfortunately is very American, put yourself in as your own utility infielder. Would you like me to explain that? Yes. It's a baseball term, utility infielder. Basically, what he's saying is, if you're a manager and suddenly you've got a vacancy in your org chart because someone's left or something like that, very, very tempting to go, yeah, I'll just do that job myself because I can do that. And then suddenly you're doing 3 people's jobs, which means you've got no time to do your own job being a manager or running it. And I personally have very, very much experienced this because I was doing 3 people's jobs in my last job. And of course, once you've demonstrated you're willing to do somebody else's job, you're never going to get to hire anybody. Because, hey, if you're doing it, that's more efficient, and efficiency is good, right? We don't care about slack. He then goes on to talk about something called process obsession, and that many companies in bad straits become obsessed with process rather than their actual output. So they like to look at process standards and regimenting everything and saying everybody must do it this way because this is the one way that works. Okay, standards are good. We all agree that standards are good because if we didn't have standards, then Andrew would not be able to plug his laptop in. Because that plug is standard, that plug socket is standard, the electricity supply is standard, and so on and so forth. Standards are great, but process standards very rarely help you to do the hard stuff any more easily. They don't make your job easier, they just make it easier to manage, in theory. He talks about something he calls the paradox of automation, which is that you automate everything that you can, but then the stuff left that isn't automated is the hardest stuff. It's the hardest stuff to do because it's stuff you can't automate. By automating all of the non-hard stuff away, what you've got left is the really hard stuff. So now all your work is really hard. So you're actually working harder, and it's more difficult than it would be if you had a selection of stuff from hard to easy to do. So you can actually automate yourself into a corner. And this is a quote from the book. Process standardization from on high is disempowerment. It's a direct result of fearful management, allergic to failure. It tries to avoid all chance of failure by having key decisions made by a guru class, those who set standards. And carried out mechanically by the regular folk. At all costs, he says, you need to avoid Taylorism. Does everybody know what I mean by Taylorism? Yeah, pretty much. So Taylor, was it William Taylor? William something Taylor? William Taylor. Somebody Taylor. Yeah. I think that Taylor was possibly the worst person in human history. Quite possibly. And I don't say that lightly. Taylorism is the idea that people are basically interchangeable pieces, and that any task, whatever it is, can be broken down into a set of fixed steps that people just repeat on a rote basis at the maximum speed they can, the most efficient manner they can, and everything can be broken down, and people basically are automata. And Taylorism is absolutely rife, or was absolutely rife in industry, particularly right the way up until the sort of the 70s and the 80s. Until things, some of the Japanese ideas, some of the German ideas started to filter into it. And there are still many places where, and this is the sort of place where if you need bathroom break, you're being timed, and your average is calculated. If you spend more than 2% of your time in the bathroom, then you get let go because somebody else can spend 1%. It's just fundamentally evil. And it does work up to a point for production line and stuff. Obviously not going to work for developers, but so many companies still have Taylorist ideas because they have managers who are brought up on Taylorist ideas as the way that you manage stuff.
I think that would also apply more to when dealing with offshore as well.
Yeah.
Offshore is also considered to be this kind of interchangeable, non-human block.
Turn them on, it's like tap, isn't it? Turn it on. So you can't treat development like an assembly line process. It doesn't work. It's a recipe for disaster. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't adopt or follow process standards at all. I want to be clear on that. I'm not advocating anarchy, and neither is DeMarco. But he says don't let them become more important than your actual delivery. Delivery is key. If you need to vary your standards or do something differently in order to deliver, that's what Slack is all about. Stand back, take a look at it, and see what you can do to change. Slavish adherence to process in the face of contradicting facts is as bad as having no process at all. First of all, bad management. Don't if it doesn't work, keep doing it. So use the process that works for you, change it when it doesn't. talks about quality and a quality obsession, which is basically as bad as process obsession. He mentions that managers don't often understand what quality really is. They assume quality just means defect-free, right? So, but that's only a very small part of what quality is, what a quality product is. Right? Most people would agree that, say, a MacBook is a quality product. People point at Apple as, quality company. What's the difference between a MacBook that makes it great versus a Toshiba laptop that people don't like? They both got screens, they both got keyboards, they compute, you can do stuff on them. It's much more subjective stuff about how they're designed, how they're built, how friendly they are to use. Are users happy using them? And that's all part of quality. A quality product needs all those things. A buggy product can still be easy to use and look great. iTunes. Equally, a bug-free product may be ugly and confusing. The Space Shuttle software. And the quality is not just applicable to the product, it's applicable to the process and everything else. So you need a quality team, good people, you need a quality schedule that's realistic, that you can meet, you need a quality budget, you need enough money to do it, you need the right people. Quality is everything. So quality is absolutely important, it's worthwhile. But again, remember, before you get obsessed, that good enough for today is better than never good enough at all. Right? If you can ship something that's not perfect now and improve it, better than keeping going until you're perfect, because you never will be. And management that gets bogged down in the notion that if it ain't defect-free, it can't be released, well, then they tend to not get very far. Here's an interesting quote from our friend Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Quantity has a quality all its own. I'll leave you to ponder what that means.
Do you think that means making millions of people die because there's war communism?
Quite possibly. Didn't want to bring politics into the session. Shouldn't have quoted Lenin, should I? Really? No, I should have quoted Lenin. I've got Stalin quote later, but maybe I'll skip over that. DeMarco then has some nasty things to say about objectives-based management. And I'm on slightly dodgy territory here because, after all, we do objectives-based management. But I do feel that we do it slightly better than other places. So he feels that objective-based management doesn't generally suit knowledge workers. And the reason why is because objectives management is primarily suited to organizations that remain static, doing the same thing all the time. There's no significant change. We do this all year long, and I can give you an objective that says do X of Y. It's reasonable that you could achieve that, and we know we're going to be doing X all the way along. So yeah, fine, we can do that. But most businesses in the 21st century, the way knowledge workers work, they aren't like that. So objectives tend to fail. Now, I don't know if you've experienced this, but many times, particularly in my last job, I would get to the end of the year and get to the annual review cycle, and I'd sit down and have a conversation with my line manager, and we'd look over my objectives, and the conversation would go basically like this. So this objective, how have I got on that? No, I didn't do that. Well, why didn't you do that? Well, it's not relevant anymore because that project's been cancelled, or because we're not doing that this year, we're doing it next year, or because we gave that to somebody else, or the fundamental technology's changed, so we're not doing it that way. Okay, well, what about this one? No, I didn't do that one either. And that one, I started it, but then I had to give up because didn't have enough time. Why didn't I have enough time? Well, because of these things that got added on that aren't actually in my objectives, but I had to do anyway. And the point of that is that unless you are literally reviewing objectives continuously throughout the year and changing them to meet reality, to make them realistic, getting rid of the ones that don't apply anymore, adding new ones, then they're meaningless. They're meaningless as a guide to the work you should be doing day to day. They also tend to override your common sense. So if you've got an objective to say deliver project X on time, and on-time delivery is the most important thing, but you're working on project X, but project X is a piece of crap. Not going to mention any projects in particular, but Andrew knows what I'm talking about. I do, yeah. That's because I like him so much. And then from your perspective, because it's your objectives and it's your bonus that you're worried about, and rightly so, you are more concerned about on-time delivery than the fact that this project's actually turned to a piece of crap. Really, you should be more concerned about the fact it's a piece of crap and do something about it. But if you do that, you won't be on time. So objectives can get in the way. This robs workers of agency. You don't have the ability to make your own call because it's been made for you, and control over what you do. And this is one thing that we as knowledge workers like to have. It's control.
It's also, have you ever read Drive and the surprising truth about what actually motivates us?
No.
So basically the whole thing is about reward and punishment doesn't actually affect human behavior. And in particular, when you set up metrics like an objective, the person will do the very minimum to hit that objective, because that is human nature. Like if they're forced into a corner and they're like, you have to do this one thing, do just that one thing.
I'll take a brief diversion actually and talk about my last job, because I don't work for anyone else, I can slag them off. And we had a phrase for that, it's called working to objectives. And there were so many people in that organisation that spent their entire time working to objectives, and that's all they did.
Yeah.
And you knew you when you got a meeting request, you know, oh yeah, that's the objectives that they're trying to finish. And more sinisterly, in the last year I was there, a couple of years, they introduced behaviours alongside objectives. So not just what you've got to do, what you've got to achieve, but how you're going to do it as well. And then at the end of the year, you got assessed on both your objectives and your behaviours. A nice little 9-box grid that says, so you could be on top of all your objectives and overachieved everywhere, but if you weren't exhibiting the right behaviours, bottom line of the box, you know, you might find yourself in trouble. And theoretically, if you went 2 quarters below a certain level, you were supposed to be managed out. I'm not going to name the organisation that I used to work for because they could sue me, but anybody that wants to know, come and ask me afterwards. So spot the pattern here, right? Authoritarian management is a common factor that links all these things, and it's a very common thing that you find in companies of all sizes and shapes, including, you know, managers become obsessed with efficiency and schedules and behaviours and objectives, and not with the actual end product. It creates a culture of fear. Some of us know all about a culture of fear around this table. Internal competition, Darwinism, trying to get one over the other team or the other guy on the team, kills morale, and it eliminates the slack that you need to respond to the change that's going to happen anyway. Organizations stagnate because they can't change. People start to leave, vicious cycle, down the plug hole. And it's really hard to come back from this, but DeMarco again says, step 1 is always bring back some slack. That's what you need. Slack is the key. This is his thesis. So some conclusions about Slack. The actions that many companies have taken in response to economic downturns have actually contributed to their failure. 100% efficiency is a myth. Even if it weren't, it is an undesirable outcome, and the reason why is because it removes slack, and slack is the key to innovation, to reinvention, to responding to change. It's interesting to know, if you go back to 60s, 70s, even the early 80s, before some of the current management fads took effect, nobody was going on about total efficiency. People were regularly having long lunches and standing around the water cooler and talking about stuff. Yeah, nobody was that efficient. Business still got done somehow. You know, things got produced. Companies made money. It was just an accepted part of how stuff was done. Then the 80s came, and all these evil ideas came out, and suddenly it was, you know, slash and burn and turn everybody into a 100% effective powerhouse. And DeMarco's, you know, position is that has really broken a lot of companies, particularly in that sector. So managers need to stop treating their staff as interchangeable resource, look at them as people with particular skill sets and capabilities, and use them accordingly. He says that middle managers are actually useful. Yay, me and Andy. And the good managers provide their people with slack, bad managers provide them with stress. I hope for those of you around the table that report to me that you would agree that I give you slack, not stress. But if not, come and talk to me, Andrew. So we've got some time left. Any questions and thoughts on any of that stuff? Would you like to tell me that I'm full of it?
It was Frederick. It's good. Frederick Taylor.
Was it?
Yeah.
Oh, like Fred Brooks. Frederick Winslow Taylor, you're right. Yes, the most evil man in history. I'm going to get a dartboard with his face on it.
Even that alone.
Just Alan.
How does this fit with the sort of higher level kind of management of this organisation?
I can possibly comment on
Doing
that.
that talk tomorrow.
I think, you know, I think there are things in here that we can recognise that happen in places around this organisation. I think there are probably things in here we can recognise that every company we've ever worked for. These things are going to happen because these sorts of managers are ubiquitous, and it's not like they're bad human beings. It's just they don't know any better. And in particular, when, you know, we're an unusual kind of group of people. We're a real nightmare for managers, for non-programming managers to manage, because they just don't understand what we do and how we do it. It's a mystery. Everything about it seems counterintuitive and wrong. and everything takes longer than it should do and costs more than it should do. Why can't it just be simpler? I mean, you know, I've got an iPad that's simple. Surely everything should be as simple as that. They don't get that our job is dealing with complexity through abstraction, and that, you know, we simplify things through abstraction to get it down to a level that, don't say this outside the room, but ordinary people can comprehend. And so, you know, software people are troublesome everywhere outside technology companies. Technology companies founded and run by software people can either be really great places for us to work or actually sometimes really bad places, depending on who it was doing the founding. But at least they understand what we do. When you make your career, as we've all done, sort of line of business, working for businesses that are not primarily technology businesses, well, I suppose Euromany now describes itself as technology-led, then you're going to come across these problems over and over again. And the thing is to have a toolkit to try and solve it with. You know, have the right stuff in the bag that you can pull out and say, well, look, all the evidence says X. Sometimes people just won't listen, in which case time to look for another job. But, you know, sometimes you can persuade them. And the mere fact that we've got away with implementing an agile methodology in this company, I think is, you know, proof of that. If I'd said to you 5 years ago that we'd be doing Scrum pretty much throughout Euromony and people right up to the DD they've already bought in, would you say that would happen? Well, if you'd been here 5 years ago, of course you weren't.
From what I've heard, no.
Yeah. So, you know, change can happen. It's not impossible, but it requires slack. And the question you have to ask yourself is, do I have slack? Anybody around the table here like to volunteer, sit down and say they've got slack? Anybody like to say they've got? Anybody would like to claim they're working at 100% efficiency? You're right. So if you didn't put your hand up the first time, the answer is you need some slack. You all need slack to do your jobs. There should be some slack built in. If you work for me and you ain't got slack, come talk to me because I need to give you something. And if you work for somebody that works for me and you haven't got slack, go talk to them.
Just plug the innovation time in this point.
Yeah, innovation time. And absolutely, that's a specific attempt to get some slack. And provided that it's approved, we'll have some slack. I just love saying slack, it's great. Yeah, we can have our hour slack, which is a subgenius reference for those of you that are old enough to remember that. Yeah. Dobbs approved. At any rate, yeah, that's what I think. So, any other thoughts? Yes, Andrew.
Okay, so I'm reading online. There's a criticism of this book by Linus Torvalds, the Linux guy, saying basically he's criticizing the fact that if you add more people to a team and a team goes beyond a certain size, that it becomes hard to manage and stick with a great effort. So he's saying that although the Linux kernel was built by a small group of dedicated developers, there are currently thousands of kernel contributors. He says that the kernel development is still scaling very efficiently.
Yeah, but they're contributors, they're not team members. It's not the same thing.
Yeah.
The kernel team is small.
Fixed deadline.
Yeah. You can have hundreds of contributors. People send you stuff. It's great. It works even better. But then there's an overhead in processing all those contributions. Somebody's got to look at all the pull requests. Someone's got to authorize them. In the case of the kernel, it's pretty much only Linus. Linus. Well, no, he pronounced it as Linus.
Is it?
Linus. Yeah. But he's Finnish Swedish. In the case of the Linux kernel, in most areas, he's the only person that can approve a pull request. There are a couple of other maintainers can do that. So actually, he's defeating his own argument because that's not what Brooks is talking about. Yes, you can have, there are projects that have involved hundreds of engineers and scientists, or laborers. I mean, building the pyramids required a lot of people. They all got done. It's not impossible. It's not impossible to run projects with very large teams. But if that project is behind and you think, I'll just add another division of workers, and you think that's going to make it go on time, then Brooks would like to have a word with you because he doesn't agree. And my experience tells me the same. But again, bear in mind that this is all applicable to software more than almost anything else. And software, for any number of reasons, is kind of special and exceptional. And we are really precious little snowflakes.
You notice quite a lot about overhead communication, doesn't it? As you add more people to a project, you have to come up with ways to allow those people to communicate. And I suppose with open source software, they've taken quite a specific way of dealing with that. But it's not linear. You can't just keep adding people and just get a completely linear output. Add more people, you'll get exactly the same degree of output all the time.
I mean, it's still just writes enough horrible commit messages or pull request type comments that puts a lot of people off. I mean, that's very good.
He's a strange chap. But yeah, I agree with you. And the communications overhead was clearly a lot bigger in the 70s, when communication was by telephone or by letter, by memo. You know, okay, maybe they had email. I don't know. I assume they had email IBM, but they certainly didn't have a Confluence or Jira or anything like that. And those tools really help. They reduce the overheads, but they don't eliminate them. And so it's just a question of scale. All of us, I imagine, in their careers at one point or another, worked on death march projects. All of us have worked on projects that were slipping, where somebody said, "Let's add people to the project." If you were on one where they actually did add people to the project, can you think of any example where it actually worked? I can't think of one. We added one person to a project and it delivered maybe about a week earlier than it would have done, because they went off and did something specific. But if I'd added more than that basically, I could leave that person to get on with it. It didn't require any management. But that's uncommon. It doesn't normally happen. As a general rule of thumb, adding people to a late software project makes it later. It's a law. Brooks says so. What about Slack? How do we feel about Slack? As a topic, as a book,
Yeah, I think certainly in this industry, we need to have that innovation time. Absolutely. You would speak to at least tackling for that. I guess the organisation will be static. So I guess the message we have to softly, by osmosis, put into the
I agree. I mean, I don't actually think there's any particular drive in Euromony for 100% efficiency. I know there's 100% recharge. That's a different thing. That's an accounting thing as much as anything else. I don't. Euromony doesn't feel to me like a relentlessly tailorist organisation. I think there are definitely some areas of concern that could be looked at from our perspective, facing into the business, as to how we work with them. But I don't feel it's necessarily that they're one of the worst examples. I've worked in considerably worse places for this sort of thing. And interestingly, some of the places you'd expect to be better, like agencies, can be really bad. Anywhere that's involved in charging out time, because unless they figure out the magic formula for how to charge 100% of my time for 80% of my actual work, and get away with it without the customer noticing, then they, generally speaking, have to bill what they work, and they want to bill as much as they can. So if I say I want to spend half my time on this project and half my time on R&D, well, they're probably not going to want to do that, because R&D pays back tomorrow, whereas working on a project pays back today. And that sort of short-termism is I think more endemic in modern companies than maybe it used to be 20, 30 years ago. No one seems to think about the medium or long term anymore. Forecasts are always like, next 6 months, 12 months. No one's making 5-year business plans anymore. Or if they do, they're really vague beyond the next 12 months or so.
Isn't that the case of Britain?
That's a criticism of modern accounting.
I know. I mean, I don't feel that's why Britain doesn't do manufacturing.
No, I think that's something.
Rob raises a good point, which is, he says, can you actually plan much further than 12 months out in a modern economy? And I suppose, in a sense, you're right, because things do change more rapidly than they did do before.
Yeah. The Chinese government will say they're planning for the next 100 years.
Yeah.
Different method.
they do have a slightly different method. I think the answer is that you can plan, as long as you expect to have to change your plan, because no plan survives contact with the enemy. But you can plan further ahead than that. It's the short-termism in the sense of, as a business manager, as a senior person in this organisation, I don't much care what happens beyond the next 12 months, because I'll worry about that when I come to it. Right now I'm focused on making the money that I said I was going to make, or reaching a particular target. It's this obsession with targets year after year after year, rather than the longer term trends.
That's the difference between a professional manager and an owner manager, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's also reflective that an awful lot of companies now are run by accountants and lawyers, and people who are not basically trained business people. The best people to run companies are people that actually, started the company, or started in that company in on the shop floor or something like that, and have been through it and experienced it. okay, you can go and take an MBA, but at the end of that, doesn't really qualify you to run a business. Being an accountant qualifies you to do accounts. Being a lawyer qualifies you to go and stand in the court and argue. And yeah, if there were easy answers, we would all have fixed it by now. But I think that some key takeaways for me certainly are, yeah, this whole idea of Slack, or let's not call it Slack, to the business, because God, they would hate that term. But yeah, innovation time to think, time to reflect, time to change. To be fair, we're doing a reasonably good job of that. The whole technical strategy thing is about change. It's about directed change and planned change and responding to the challenges that we have. And okay, most of the effort on that is coming from the middle management layer and then filtering down, but it's being done, and we have the time to do it. Yeah. Well, I tried.
Well, it was interesting. I was going to say there's quite a few of those issues raised by both those authors who kind of wound away into their John manifestos. There's quite a lot of stuff, talking about people interactions over processes and tools, and time to reflect and to think about what's going to happen, delivering value, not just opportunity.
Exactly. But if you're pushing those ideas forward in the face of a hostile management culture, then it's very easy to get dispirited and feel like you can't win, so let's quit and move somewhere else, where you have exactly the same problems all over again. So, time to make a stand. Let's not go on strike until we get Slack. But seriously, so I hope there was something of benefit in that. I recommend reading both books if you've got the time. It's a bit of a slog, particularly for techies who'd much rather be reading books about tech. But it does affect everything that we do, and I think it's knowledge that's very worthwhile for you to have in your career, whatever stage you're at, because it will serve you well at some point when you're talking with a relatively clueless manager who doesn't understand what you do and needs to be made to understand it in terms that they can actually relate to. So if anybody has any other thoughts or queries or anything wants to talk about at any point, my door is always open. Otherwise, I'm having to think about what the next one of these will be, probably a bit more technical, trying to find a more technical topic that we can address. But if anyone's got any ideas, stuff they'd like to see, do come and talk to me. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming.
I just have one more thought.
Yeah.
Everyone can leave, but I just have one more thought. In that the whole Slack concept that's really built into modern economics and therefore modern business, that you're not utilizing